Hello, everyone. It's good to see everyone's faces, both in person and on Zoom. Hello, everyone. My name is Bill, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight. This is my first time teaching here, so I come as a guest. I come with respect for this community, respect for the teachers who have held this space, and respect for each of you has shown up to practice, and respect for your practice. A little about me. Most of my adult life was spent in the military, much of it in special operations, and later through my own suffering and really through my own need to find a way back to my own heart, I came to the Buddhist Dharma. So I don't come to this practice as an abstract thing. I came to it because I needed it, and I stayed because I fell in love with it. I found in this path, not a belief system, but a practice, a way of seeing, a way of remembering, a way of returning again and again to something that was deeper than my conditioning. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge the land that we are practicing on. Today we gather on the unceded homelands of the northern Chumash people, and I offer respect to their elders, past, present, and future, and to the long chain of relationship and stewardship and connection that they have with this land and these waters. And I also want to name something both simple and important. Everyone is welcome. All bodies, all backgrounds, all races, cultures, ages, abilities, all gender identities and orientations, all of our histories and beliefs, doubts, wounds, and our countless unique ways of being. No one is outside of the circle of practice. In the deepest sense, this is not just a diversity statement, this is the Dharma. Because beneath all of our conditioning, beneath all of our stories, beneath all of the many ways that we separate ourselves from ourselves and from each other, we belong to the same field of life. And I understand, thanks to Mick here, that we've been moving through the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana, and that you're currently working on a foundation of form or body. So I want to stay very close to that tonight, but I also want to come at mindfulness from a different angle and from its roots. And I want to do this as an exploration, something that we can experience together very practically, not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as something we can experience together. So let's begin very simple with a practice of awareness. And this comes from U Thanjaniya, who was a student of U Pandita, who was a student of the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition of Burma. I encourage you, I invite you to close your eyes or keep your eyes gently opened, slightly downcast, and bring your hands together. Nothing special, just let one hand touch the other. Maybe the palms touch, maybe the fingers touch, maybe one hand rests inside of the other. Just let the hands meet. Now, ask yourself very simply, can I feel my hands? Not as theory, not as a meditation technique, just directly. Can I feel my hands? Touch, pressure, warmth, vibration. And notice something. Is it hard to be aware of the hands? Are you straining? Are you manufacturing awareness? Or is awareness always already here? You just have to be aware that it's here. In one sense, awareness is built into experience. There's touch. Touch is already known. If there's sound, sound is already known. If there's breathing, breathing is known. Experience arises with its own knowing. That's not something that we have to create. It's already happening. So awareness in this very basic sense is very simple. Can I feel my hands? Yes, there is awareness. But now let's make this a little more interesting. Let's transition to a practice of mindfulness. Keep feeling your hands, same grounding object, same simple experience, but now become curious. Is my awareness of the hands continuous? Do I stay with the hands without interruption? Or are there little breaks? You may notice a thought in the background. You may suddenly realize you were thinking. Then the hands return, or maybe you hear a sound, or you feel the body, or start evaluating whether you're doing this exercise right, or maybe there's just a blankness, and then suddenly the hands return. So ask yourself, did awareness of the hands remain continuous, or did awareness disappear and then return? This is where mindfulness begins to become interesting. Awareness is simple. Can I feel my hands? Yes. But mindfulness is awareness over time. Mindfulness is the capacity to stay connected to what we've chosen to remember. And what do we discover almost immediately? Anyone? No? Well, perhaps you notice that we forget. At first we're aware of the hands, and then suddenly we forget. And then somehow, mysteriously, we remember again. Aware, forget, remember, return. That's the rhythm of practice, and really, this is the rhythm of a human life. So the word mindfulness is the English word that we've inherited largely through the early translators like T.W. Rice Davids. But the Pali word is sati. And sati carries this beautiful meaning of remembering. not remembering as nostalgia or thinking about the past, remembering as the event of coming back, remembering the body, remembering the breath, remembering the hands, remembering the present moment, remembering the Dharma, remembering how we want to live. And if we look honestly, we see this basic pattern always. Aware, forget, remember, aware, forget, remember. The practice isn't to never forget. That's not how the human mind works. The practice is to remember again, and to remember again without turning the forgetting into a problem. And that's important because forgetting isn't a moral failure. It's not something that you're doing wrong. It's actually the human condition, the ordinary condition. But when we forget, awareness of something doesn't just disappear into nothing. Instead, our awareness moves into conditioning. When we forget and we move into conditioning, it moves into old patterns of thought, old fears, old cravings, resentments, self-protections, and then those patterns of mind become patterns of speech and action. This is why practice matters, because the problem is usually not that we don't know what we value. Most of us do, but we know we want to be kind. We know that we want to be patient. We know that we want to love well. The problem is that we forget. And when we forget, conditioning takes over. And this isn't just a Buddhist insight. Every deep wisdom tradition seems to have noticed the same human wound, this gap between what we aspire and our actions, between what we love in one hand and how we find ourselves living, between what we know in our hearts and what we actually do when fear and anger and confusion take over. Shantideva says this beautifully. Although I wish to be free from suffering, I run towards suffering itself. Although I wish for happiness, I destroy my own happiness as if it were my enemy. That's the human condition. We want freedom, and yet we act in ways that deepen bondage. We want happiness, and yet we keep feeding the habits that create unhappiness. St. Paul says something very similar. I don't understand what I do, for what I want to do I do not do, but what I hate to do. And then he says, for I have the desire to do what's good, but I can't carry it out. Now, we don't have to be a Christian, all right, to understand the truth of this observation, that this isn't just about guilt. St. Paul provides us a precise description of the divided mind and heart. The aspiration is there, the love is there, the longing to do what's good is there, but the capacity to remember the aspiration hasn't yet been trained. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asks, why is a person impelled to commit acts even unwillingly, as if by force? And that's such a human question. Why do we keep doing the thing that we know causes harm? Why do we act against our own deepest knowing? Why do I get pulled again and again into patterns I already know that don't lead to my freedom? And Carl Jung gives us the same teaching, yet in this instance, he uses psychological language. He says, in the popular form, until you make the unconscious conscious, the unconscious will direct your life, and then you'll call it fate. That's exactly what we're practicing with sati. When we forget, conditioning lives us. When we remember, we begin to see the conditioning. And when we see the conditioning clearly, we're no longer condemned to repeat it unconsciously, because what we once called fate, we just begin to recognize as old habit patterns. And what we recognize as a pattern, we can learn to meet with awareness, and that's where freedom begins. Let me bring in a modern example that I think we all can relate to. All right, I'm driving. I have an aspiration to just stay aware of the activity of driving. Hands on the wheel, the car in front of me, my speed. And for a little while, I remember the activity of driving. Then, outside of my choice, something happens. I forget. And then maybe a minute later, maybe 5 minutes later, maybe an hour later, suddenly, outside of my control, I remember again that I was intending, my aspiration was to pay attention to my driving, and yet I wasn't. What matters here isn't that you forgot, right? What matters is what happened during the forgetting. Anyone? The car may still be moving, but somehow conditioning has taken the wheel, not only in the intricate and complex task of driving, but also where awareness goes. Awareness is lost in the past, perhaps filled with shame. Awareness is projecting itself into an imagined future filled with fear. And this is how we live much of our lives. Mindfulness, however, does two things. It shortens the periods of our forgetting, and over time, it changes the conditioning that takes over when we forget. So, this is why we practice sati. We practice remembering, not to become a better Buddhist, not to become spiritual, not to escape life, but to remember, moment by moment by moment. Remember what? Remember how we most deeply aspire to think, speak, and act. To remember love before fear takes the wheel. To remember patience before anger becomes speech or deed. To remember compassion before judgment hardens the heart. Remember the body before the mind disappears in the story. Remember the breath before we become our reactivity. And to remember that this moment, right now, just as it is the place where practice happens. So this brings us back to the body. In the first foundation of mindfulness, the body isn't some lesser practice before we get to the real spiritual stuff. The body is in fact the doorway, the portal. The body is, think of the body as your own personal mindfulness bell. When forgetting happens, the body knows. When anger is here, the body knows. How? Tight jaw, heat, pressure, contraction. When fear is here, the body knows. Chest tightens, belly drops, breath shortens. And the body is also where remembering begins. So feel the hands, feel the breath, feel the feet, feel the posture. Return to the foundation of form, not because the body is separate from awakening, but because the body is where awakening can be known directly. So the practice is simple. It's not easy, but simple. Choose an anchor. Bring your awareness to know the anchor. Notice forgetting has just happened, and then remember, return without self-judgment and repeat. The practice is not to never forget. The practice is to remember again and again without turning the forgetting into a problem. And maybe this is the whole path, right? Because we forget who we are. We forget what we love. We forget how we want to live. We forget tenderness beneath the fear. All right? And then through practice, we remember, not once, not permanently, but again and again and again, breath by breath, moment by moment, we can shorten the gap of forgetting, right? Shorten the gap between living according to our aspirations and living driven by our conditioning. So this isn't a philosophy, all right? Know it directly in the body, in this breath, in this moment. So, thank you everyone for listening today, all right? And I honor your practice. Have a beautiful day.